Please welcome President Minouche Shafik.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Minouche Shafik, and I'm the president of Columbia University. And I wanted to thank you all for coming to this event on the war in Gaza, Constructive Campus Conversations. This is a topic that's very difficult to discuss, and I want to start by just acknowledging that. The events of the last 8 weeks, starting with the October 7th terrorist attack, and now with the war between Israel and Hamas, and the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, have caused great pain and suffering. And many people in our community have been affected directly, and some of the emotions and disagreements have spilled over onto our campus. But this is also a teachable moment. The two scholars who will speak here today are wonderful examples of what universities can contribute during times like these. Amaney Jamal of Princeton and Keren Yarhi-Milo of Columbia, one Palestinian, one Israeli, are friends and former colleagues and have argued that universities need to step up to the challenge of enabling uncomfortable conversations and demonstrating mutual respect. I'm sure they disagree on issues, but they agree on the importance of conversation rooted in scholarship and the value of dialogue. And I want to applaud their courage and thank them for being here. Many years ago, I had the extraordinary opportunity of working on the economic underpinnings of the Oslo peace process when I was an economist at the World Bank. And it was a time of great hope. And even though the process ultimately failed, it taught me one of the great lessons of my professional life, that it's possible for people to overcome huge differences if they're willing to sit down and talk. Navigating these past couple of months on campus has been a challenge, to say the least, and I have felt keenly the passion and pain of our brilliant students, faculty, and wider community who have deep personal connections to this conflict. And I've had hundreds and hundreds of conversations with students, faculty, and alumni to understand the different ways their lives have been touched by it. So often these conversations end up being about what are Columbia's values? And I think it's important to reassert those values during turbulent times. One thing that is sacrosanct is the intellectual freedom of our students and faculty to debate issues and come to their own views. It's our job to teach people how to think, not what to think. And this is an essential Columbia value. And this in practice is remarkably difficult work, as the past 2 months have shown all of us, since everything we say is interpreted through a political lens and then distorted and amplified through social media. Nevertheless, it is our job to honor our mission of education and research and engage with each other to help find solutions. Here at a university, the question should not be, what side are you on? Instead, it can be, what can we learn from history? And what are the political and economic and social issues? And how does literature and the arts inform the debate? Here is a place where students can discover the many complex sides to every issue. That is also a Columbia value. And none of this is possible without a commitment to thoughtful, rigorous debate that respects our collective rights to learn, work, and live together, free from bigotry, intimidation, and harassment. It means applying rules of conduct fairly to all, because everyone has a right to feel safe, welcome, and heard at Columbia. And creating an environment where people feel challenged and learn to navigate the discomfort that comes with that, another Columbia value. And it's not okay to cast civility aside because the moment is too heated. We must cultivate a university culture that pushes back on the forces that seek to divide us, a culture that encourages empathy, not personal attacks on individuals or identities. Learning to speak, listen with respect, That too is a cherished Columbia value. So over the months ahead, we will be launching a set of initiatives that will encourage dialogue across difference, to foster discussion and activities across Columbia that bring people together. And events like today are an important step in modeling the kind of intellectual debate and humane behavior that we aspire to. So thank you again, Amaney and Keren, and I now want to hand it over to Claire Shipman, co-chair of our Board of Trustees, who has kindly agreed to moderate this very important conversation. Claire, over to you.
Thank you, Minouche. On behalf of our Board of Trustees, I want to acknowledge, Minouche, your hard work at steering us so well through this really complicated issue over the last few months. These are not easy times, as you can imagine, to be a university president. Columbia can be an especially challenging place, as we know, but that's because it's full of extraordinarily brilliant, passionate students and faculty who like to make their views known. That is what we love about Columbia. At the same time, that's why at this moment, Minouche, we're grateful for your steady hand, your deep knowledge of the world, and your commitment to care for our community. Thank you. Dean Jamal and Dean Yarhi-Milo, welcome. We are lucky to have two such incredible, distinguished scholars here to discuss this complicated issue. Yep. And Amaney, a special thanks to you for coming all the way from Princeton to dive into this issue for us here on campus.
That's my privilege. Thank you for having me.
I know you had a similar conversation at Princeton on Tuesday. I hear that was spectacular, so we're really looking forward to this. And I want to offer a sentence or two about each of them. You may have read about them in advance, and this will not do either of them justice, but just so you know who we have. Amaney Jamal is Dean of the Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. She's also the Edwards S. Sanford Professor of Politics and a Professor of Politics and International Affairs at Princeton, and directs the Workshop on Arab Political Development and the Bobst American University of Beirut Collaborative Initiative. Jamal's current research focuses on the drivers of political behavior in the Arab world, Muslim immigration to the United States and Europe, and the effect of poverty and inequality on political outcomes. Her books include the award-winning Barriers to Democracy, which you should all read. It's terrific, and she has received numerous additional awards and honors. Keren Yarhi-Milo is the Dean of Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs and the Adlai Stevenson Professor of International Relations and the author of Who Fights for Reputation? The Psychology of Leaders in International Conflict. She too is an award-winning scholar with an extensive record of leadership and service. Her work draws on cutting-edge insights from psychology, organizational theory, and behavioral economics to explore the complicated contexts that surround decision-making and perception in international relations. Her work has been featured virtually everywhere, academic journals, the New York Times, Foreign Affairs. Thank you both.
Thank you.
So let me just talk about the obvious here. Keren, you are an Israeli American. Amaney, you are Palestinian American. You are colleagues and friends. Keren taught at Princeton. Amaney taught here. It's just amazing. Last month, the two of you, who might seem like sort of strange partners, together penned an op-ed for the New York Times on civil discourse. It was an incredible piece. I know we had a terrific reaction to it at Columbia. What was your hope for that piece in writing it? What have you found the reaction to be? And do you think it's a template for what we can do moving forward? Amaney, I'll start with you.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Claire. First, it's a great honor and privilege to be here. Thank you, President Minouche, for that introduction. I want to thank you all for attending, students and faculty. I'm really looking forward to the opportunity to having this conversation, and thank you, Claire, for moderating. So, you know, when Keren and I became friends, so it starts with our friendship. Keren joined the faculty at Princeton while I'm on the faculty at Princeton. At the time, Keren and I would often talk about the peace process, and both of us were invested in the peace process. Both of us were hoping that some sort of miraculous turn would happen. This was like around, you know, late 2000s into that decade. We were hoping that maybe somehow, some way, that momentum of pushing the peace process apart would sort of reverse. So we would often find ourselves talking about the nitty-gritty, what was happening on the Palestinian side, what was happening on the Israeli side. You know, I would go in and say, I can't believe, you know, something, you know, this happened in Israel, and she would come back and say, well, you know, what happened on the PA side, and we would just talk it out. And when this whole catastrophe sort of emerged on October 7th, and then all the subsequent attacks and whatnot in Gaza, and we saw what was happening, we just started talking together. I think in a way, when you are sort of confused with what's happening in the world, you want to talk to people that you've talked to before about this conflict. So when I want to figure out what's happening in Israel, what people are saying in Israel, I typically pick up the phone and talk to Keren, and she does the same. So as we were talking, she was talking about some of her concerns. We're both now deans. We weren't deans then, but now we're deans. You know, our area of expertise, you know, revolves around this issue, and now we're deans, and we also we have a responsibility towards our communities. And as deans, first and foremost, at least for me, is that we want to ensure that all voices are heard, that all voices are respected, that we ensure that there's safe spaces for these conversations to happen in a respectful manner. You know, because I grew up, and Keren knows this, and I often talk to her about this, I grew up as Palestinian American. You know, back in the day, you know, you would have to sometimes self-censor even saying, I'm a Palestinian American, right? You know, I remember saying that once in a class, and somebody responded to me and said, well, how many people did you kill? And so the idea is, having lived that experience, we want to make sure that spaces for our students will always be provided and guaranteed and secured. So I was talking to Keren about this, and we were also seeing the alarming situation in this country. This is a very polarized country. Our students are inheriting a conflict that has been polarized and pushed to the extremes for some time, where people haven't been dialoguing, and this was concerning to us. So we decided to do something, and we talked about the op-ed, but we talked about also other programming. We talked about, you know, quite honestly, as deans, we were both sort of shocked that even in our own schools, we don't have any programs geared towards peace and coexistence. What does that work take? So this is like, we were also looking at ourselves in the mirror, but we wanted to pen an op-ed that says that there's time for mutual respect here. We want to make sure, you know, freedom of expression is guaranteed. We want to also make sure that this is a moment to educate and learn about the context and the history of Oslo. And why is that important? Because I'm tired of, personally, people always saying that Palestinians and Israelis will never get along. They all want to kill each other. This is not true, and this is a moment to educate. So for all these reasons, we decided to pen the op-ed. And I can talk about other parts of that op-ed, but I do want to give Keren a chance to speak too. Yeah.
So, Amaney, thank you so much for coming. And it's great to be with you and talk about this. So we've had these conversations even before last spring. Are we, as scholars, have done enough? Are we, as deans, you know, doing enough on this topic? And when, after October 7, and we started talking, and we saw, you know, we were really, you know, glad to see that our community is interested about things that are happening in Israel and in Gaza and in the Middle East. And because the last thing we want is, you know, students who are political, you know, that there's political apathy in our student body. So seeing that activism and you know, that people are out there caring about this is great. And you know, we were really happy to see this, because we were concerned that this was not a topic we were talking about enough in terms of the context of the peace process and so on. But, you know, and the importance of protests are significant, you know, psychologically. You can think about it politically. But there is one important thing that we also realize, and Amaney, you talked about this at Princeton, that at the end of the day, we all know that the solution to this conflict is a political solution. And the political solution requires that we talk to one another, both as Israelis and as Palestinians, that we have difficult conversations, that we allow ourselves to be a little bit uncomfortable, but push each other question our assumptions, be in a dialogue with people we disagree with. And through that conversation, learn something, learn to listen, not just protest and say what we think is right. Replace these exclamation marks with question marks and provide real forums for those kinds of conversations. And we have a platform that we can do this, and we must do this in universities, in our classrooms, in our schools, to allow for this conversation. Every time I speak with Amaney, she challenges me. She teaches me something that I don't know. And I want, and we want to see this with our students. We want to see them engaging in civil disagreement too. We want them to ask questions about the history, the context. So that is very important. And then the last point is, at the end of the day, universities are the best place to do this. And this is our responsibility to offer this. It's our responsibility to guide them, to guide our students. But it's not just the students, it's the faculty, it's everybody in our community. And how to engage with this conflict in a nuanced, productive way. And that's also one other aspect that we cared a lot about and hope that we're doing what we need to be doing.
Well, just to get quite specific, because it's manifestly clear looking around the country and looking at this political explosion that nobody really has all of the answers to handling this situation well right now. We at Columbia are certainly working nonstop to listen and adapt, innovate, but we have to admit, as for our board, we can always do better. And I think, in the op-ed, you talked about civil discourse, you talked about empathy, you talked about respect. Certainly events like this are a great start. We've had a few of them at Columbia. What else specifically do you think can help bring our students together to listen and learn, really, in the next few weeks or months that we could implement right away?
So if I can step in here. So I just want to sort of, segue, and I know that just to speak a little bit about what I often hear from students, especially on the Palestinian side or the pro-Palestinian side. So when you take what's happening within the context of the university solely as a snapshot, sometimes you'll say, okay, well, we're offering these opportunities for engagement, what's going on, why is there dissatisfaction? But when you take the snapshot of, like, let's say the whole country, or all of Europe, for example, where you already have sometimes a media establishment and a political establishment that does not humanize the Palestinian perspective or the Palestinian voices, I think this creates a lot more of an emotional reaction, but not an emotional reaction that the way it's often portrayed as emotional, irrational reaction. It's an emotional reaction to be feeling dehumanized, to feeling like your version of the story is not being heard. So when we talk about civilized discourse and empathy, it's not simply saying, okay, I'm just going to treat you like another student. I think what our students sometimes need to hear is like, I understand when, let's say, a representative, which I heard and said, the best solution in Gaza is to kill them all. Just kill them all. So I think it means a lot to our students when you can say, that's not okay. It is not okay to call for the killing of an entire people. And as universities, we want to offer a better model than to this, basically, this complete dehumanization cycle. So oftentimes I feel our students need to hear this from us as educators and administrators. And then you enter the civilized discourse sort of opportunity. So I've been taking a lot of time to sort of reflect on this myself, because oftentimes we get caught up in the day-to-day as administrators. And our calendars are booked. I'm jumping from one meeting to the other, and then in between my daughter calls me and says like she can't find her lunch or something. So it's like we're juggling, we're trying to make things work, and then you sort of sit down at night. You're like, maybe I should have reflected on what's being said in the media or what's being said in Washington D.C. that is very, very injurious to specifically Palestinian and pro-Palestinian and Muslim students, and quite honestly, sometimes Jewish perspectives that are much more progressive. they haven't fit into these categories, so they also sort of feel disempowered. So that's the kind of thing that I reflect upon, and I'm trying actually day by day to make sure that I am able to acknowledge hurtful speech and dehumanizing speech.
Yeah, absolutely. And I will just add that, look, this is really hard work. Peace is hard work. And it requires, trial and error. And what we're going to do at this university, what we've done, we're going to try different things. And we're going to try different ways of engaging with students. And it could be that it's teachings and it's small, right? It could be that it is trying to bring different groups and try perspective taking, but maybe not now. Maybe we're not ready for this. Maybe this will be the right thing to do in a few weeks. So we've done a lot in terms of, there were webinars that were more in terms of bringing experts from the region, from the United States, and hearing a perspective of views. That's one way of engaging the students. There were small teachings where we brought faculty. There were small circles so there are different things that we're going to offer, and some of them will work well. Some of them we will learn lessons and we'll say, maybe not yet, or maybe we can do this better. This is hard work, but we must get to that point. Otherwise, we're going to just, we're not going to get to real dialogue, a meaningful dialogue, and meaningful way to move forward in the conversation.
I also want to say, as co-chair of our board, and my co-chair's right out there with me, David, that we both would want to assure our students that our number one concern has been student safety. And we are focused on that nonstop. And we also hear and appreciate that some of our students do feel unsafe, and also I would say more psychologically battered, really just psychologically exhausted. I think our Jewish students are seeing an uptick in anti-Semitic incidents, which is really painful. Our Muslim students feel marginalized, not heard. I'm wondering whether, and this was something somebody in the audience mentioned to me before we started, whether the two of you have had moments when you have learned something extraordinary from some of these conversations that would give you the other side, a perspective from the other side. If you had to articulate, wow, this is the thing that's most painful for my Jewish students, for my Palestinian students, has there been a sort of aha moment like that for either of you that is kind of puts you in the opposite perspective-taking side?
So I've responded first every single time. I'm happy to do it.
Yeah,
Are you okay with that?
Yeah, for sure, yeah.
Okay. So when I began to teach politics of the Middle East, of course, we deal with the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. You look at your students, you realize that you have a bunch of students and they're coming from different backgrounds and different experiences. And my job as an educator is to capture those experiences and that nuance. So to do that, one of the exercises I started employing in my school, what I found also is that some of our students came into the classroom better informed than others.
Yes.
And if you're taking your cues, I hate to say this, but sometimes just from our own media sometimes, it's not always the most nuanced and most elaborate and most contextualized sometimes. And I hope we can all do a better job on this. Sorry.
It's true. That's true.
So then it's our job to educate.
Yeah.
So I used to do this exercise that I loved, which was, we would take an issue in the conflict, 2 states, Jerusalem, what kind of security cooperation, and here's the debate. Everybody has to sign up to take a position of the debate. Typically, pro-Israelis would take the Israeli side, and pro-Palestinians would take the Palestinian side. Then I would say, okay, you understand that we're going to grade this, and this is an exercise. So everybody who signed up for this side has to defend the other side, and everybody who signed up for this other side has to defend the other side. And I'm going to grade you on the merits of the argument. Right. And it would be useful if you just asked yourself one random question. If I was born Palestinian or if I was born Israeli, how would I defend this? And that's hard work.
It's very hard work.
That's very hard work.
That's great work.
But for me also, in this sort of conversation, in this mission of education, I've also wanted to evolve. I grew up on the West Bank. I grew up under occupation. So I have a narrative about that. We can talk about that. There's no way I'm ever going to be able to say that experience is positive. And as Palestinians, we do not want to live under occupation. But I also wanted to appreciate, for me, I want to appreciate why the average sort of Israeli is not also standing with me demanding the end of the occupation, right? And so then that's where the sort of misinformation sort of fits in. And this is where education has a really key role to play. So for example, what I want to highlight here is that if we believe at a moment in time the average Israeli and the average Palestinian are rational actors, they both want the same thing.
Yep.
They both want the same thing. They want to live in dignity and respect and freedom in their lands. They want their children to have better opportunities than they did. And they don't want to have to confront, quote unquote, what they see as a threatening other in their daily lives. So how do we get there? So this is where you begin to learn about, like, okay, the experiences of, let's say, the psychology of Israelis and the psychology of Palestinians. What are the trigger words? What are the buzzwords? How can I sort of make sure I'm talking or addressing Israelis, convincing them that we as Palestinians need our future state, while ensuring that it's not going to jeopardize their security or vice versa. So this takes a lot of sort of elaborate, dedicated patience, but also commitment to know. And I stand here before you because I'll say this over and over. I'm convinced if we're going to have a Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza, that we're going to have to work with our Israeli counterparts, like-minded Israeli counterparts, who will also stand up, as Ishaq Rabin did, and said it's time to end the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and that should be the future Palestinian state. So I can go on and on. So thank you for that.
But I totally agree. And look, I mean, we are in the business of educating the next generation of leaders. I mean, we're not national security advisors or presidents, but they might be. Exactly. And this is really important that they have the history, they have the context, they have the ability. I mean, our society is so polarized around many issues. And part of it is bigger than just the Arab-Israeli conflict. The ability to be in a place where you are around people that you disagree with and you want to understand how to convince, how to reach consensus, how to reach across the aisle to build something. That's what a peace process between Israelis and Palestinians will require. So if we want to really, educate the next generation of leaders to solve some of those big problems, we have to give them knowledge, but we also have to give them skills. And this combination is what universities, the only place that this can be done is in university, but we have a responsibility to do it the right way and be very creative in how we do this. And perspective taking is one way, and it's hard to do, and it's a great thing to do. But there are different ways that we can do this.
Well, you're both really now, I think, experts on university conflict resolution, but you're also expert political scientists. So since we've started to get into this substance, I want to ask you each a substantive question or two about the conflict. Keren, I'll start with you. What do you think about the U.S. role at the moment in terms of either the orchestrating, ceasefire, next stage in the conflict? And actually, one of the questions we got from a CEPA student was, what role should the U.S. play in this conflict, and what do our goals need to be in order to mitigate harm?
Right. So obviously, this is a very difficult and complex conflict, and within the larger conflict, what we have now in terms of the war itself is also very, it's a complicated situation, unprecedented in some ways in terms of the military situation, if you look at the war aims of Israel and so on. The United States is playing a key role. I don't think that we can really get anywhere meaningful without the U.S. Diplomacy, shuttle diplomacy, but also the personal involvement of President Biden was crucial in few very concrete ways. One, early on, coming and visiting Israel and the public statements, from the perspective of Israelis, he established trust with the people of Israel. He has more credibility right now than the Prime Minister of Israel. And this is going to be important because, as we will see in the future, there will be difficult decisions that the Netanyahu government in Israel will have to make about after what happens after the ceasefire, what happened when the war ends. And you will have to go to be able to, for the United States to play a key role in getting both the government of Israel, but the people of Israel, to agree to think about what are the possibilities and so on. But Biden also played, so in terms of leverage even, he gained a lot by going to Israel and being so supportive early on. The United States, the administration, in terms of the deterrence, during the early stages with the aircraft carrier, with other different things that were done, also helped significantly contain the war, that you don't have Hezbollah being really involved to the extent that they can be involved, and the escalation and so on. So it was a very powerful deterrent threat that so far seems to be working. But then also, when it comes to the ceasefire that you have now, the exchange of hostages for humanitarian aid, the United States was the key player, and President Biden himself had to intervene personally twice in order for it not to fail. So the United States is going to play a key role not just in this conflict, but also in the discussion of the post-war. But it's not the only player that is important and critical, and probably not even sufficient for us to really think about what happens next. The other players are Qatar, Egypt, and probably Saudi Arabia at a regional level, and their interests vary, right? I mean, and also what their interests publicly, what they say publicly that they want, and what privately those leaders really want. And they definitely don't want Hamas to stay in Gaza by the end of this conflict, especially not Egypt, and definitely not Saudi Arabia. So those other actors, and if you think about Saudi Arabia also playing a key role because of the deal that was supposed to be, that was advancing pretty well before October 7, that deal could be a game changer in the post-war configuration. I can talk about it more. So to your question, the United States is playing a key role, and also you see this with Bill Burns and what's happening behind the scenes in terms of getting the hostages released and so on, but it's not the only country that is playing a key role at the moment.
Well, and Amaney, you talked about this a little bit, but I think from the rubble of all of this horror, there has been the revival of talk of a two-state solution. Do you think that is a real possibility? And again, this ties into another question we got from a SEPA student, which is, will the people of Gaza be able to elect a government that supports a two-state solution and living in peace with the Jewish state? Is this something that can be forced on the people of Gaza?
So those are two great questions, and they tie into the question you asked Keren about the role of the U.S. So if you're looking at what transpired after October 7th, so there's I want two time periods, everything leading up to October 7th and then post-October 7th. In terms of the role of the United States, and not only the United States, but also Europe and also other Arab countries, right? We've had a stalemate in the peace process for over 2 decades, right? Mm-hmm. The Camp David summit that met to finalize the peace agreements. That meant that when the Israelis and Palestinians got to Camp David, a good amount of the work of reconciliation had been done, and Camp David was to fine-tune some of those aspects. So they did not succeed, they did not reach agreement at Camp David, but it did not necessarily fail. It sort of ended because the Clinton administration's term ended, but the peace process shouldn't have ended.
Yeah.
And for the longest time, there has been this discourse about, well, there's security in Palestine, Israel, without a peace treaty. And meanwhile, for the Palestinians, the West Bank has been shrinking. We've seen the expansion of settlements. At the eve of Oslo, there was 100,000 settlers on the West Bank. Today, there's 750,000. Gaza basically was Hamas was in a sort of like a tacit ceasefire agreement with the Netanyahu government. The successive Israeli regimes have become more right-wing and not invested in peace. So where was the U.S. for the last time period? So where was that peace process? So that's something that I've often asked, right? If the U.S. is really central to the peace process, it should be involved consistently in that peace process. Since October 7th, sort of Keren talked about the Biden administration's role on the Israeli side. I think on the Palestinian and more on the Muslim side, there's been a lot of disappointment. And the reason why is the point that I've sort of started with is that there seems, I mean, again, what happened was atrocious for Israelis, but you've also had over 15,000 Palestinians killed in the last 2 months. And again, though it appears that the discourse is that those Palestinian lives matter less than Israeli lives. And so this is a wound that every student or individual carries because you didn't see a humanitarian outrage emanating from the US or from Europe when it came to the Palestinian citizens in Gaza. Palestinian citizens, Claire, who half of that whole population of Gaza was born after the 2006 elections that everybody keeps citing. In our own polls, 2/3 of the Palestinians of Gaza do not support Hamas. So again, they're very much victims of this conflict. And that was not captured, that was not captured in the sentiment. So this is where the frustration is. Now, sorry about that. Now moving forward in terms of will the US play a constructive role? I hope so. I hope that the peace process is revived. What role will the citizens of Gaza play in a future sort of Palestinian state or future elections? I always say this when people ask me this question. First of all, we want to ensure that the citizens of Gaza survive this next phase, that they're not displaced from Gaza. This is very important. But again, if there are clear goals, right? So what we had on the Palestinian side are elections that didn't result in anything. The whole Palestinian Authority project was to lead to a Palestinian state. It did not. So what you got was a Palestinian Authority that increasingly became more corrupt and more authoritarian. And the joke on the Palestinian street was, we used to be occupied by one power, today we're occupied by two. So to have elections, to have another government simply repress its own people without the future hope of statehood and freedom is going to be another failed experiment. There needs to be like people are talking about like this inverted Oslo, where you state the goals up front. You state that Palestinian statehood is going to happen up front, and then you work towards that. I think the U.S. can play a critical role on that process. I hope it does, but we'll have to see.
That depends on the political realities in Israel too.
Yeah. What do you think about, you study the political psychology of people. What is in Netanyahu's mind right now?
Oh, I mean, well, I mean, look, I just want everybody to remember October 6th in Israel and the reality of October 6th in Israel. You had a country that was deeply, deeply divided over the judicial overhaul that Benjamin Netanyahu was trying to implement in Israel. I won't say it was close to civil war, it wasn't, but it was really unprecedented in terms of the internal divisions. So that was, and Bibi Netanyahu's legal issues that were looming. It was 5 election campaigns. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict never came up as an election or a political issue. It was all about Benjamin Netanyahu and the judicial overall. It's on the issue of the foreign policy that was the good news in Israel, right? The prospect of the Saudi deal. Things looked calm with Hamas, the idea that Qatar was funneling the money and they're staying, So domestically, socially, it was not good. Foreign policy, security-wise, seemed very optimistic. That was October 6th. And the political division in Israel were so significant that the people that you see now with Netanyahu sitting with him in the war cabinet, they cannot stand him. They cannot, they fought 5 election campaigns. So October 7 comes, and all of a sudden, this whole reality is just flipped on its head. There is a lot of unity internally because of the attacks. And the issue of Israel's security, for the first time, people feel really, really scared, that this is an existential threat. So you have the people at the top, the leaders, who are formed in this kind of small cabinet. They are political rivals. They know that they cannot trust each other. They are, Benjamin Netanyahu, in terms of his popularity with the Israeli public, has never been lower. This is like single digit in terms of support. It's unprecedented how unpopular he is. The factions in his government, the settlers movement of Ben Gvir, Smotrich, used to be very popular. Now they're really not. And this is when they have that group, that small group of people cannot stand each other, but they still have to make really hard decisions. The hardest decisions of their life, and not knowing really what happens, because there's no strategy for post-conflict, there's no real endgame, there's no peace process to go back to. So the uncertainty with the crisis situation, with the personal relationship, is really, really problematic. And everybody in Israel knows that his time is up. The question is, how do you get to a point where he's being removed? Is it going to be an election? Probably. The question is when and what the mechanisms and so on. And those are the questions that we're going to see playing out. But
it's, make sure I'm keeping somewhat to time. I think we have about 10 or 15 minutes left. One of the questions we had from a law student was to try to describe in the most objective and descriptive terms possible the gap in knowledge between students on your campuses now. And I think what they mean is about this particular conflict, the history. Yes. If you each had to say, what do you think is fundamentally misunderstood about the Israeli-Palestinian divide for each group? How would you describe that?
So there are a lot of, I see gaps in knowledge in different ways. I mean, when I taught in class, and I teach with Secretary Clinton in class on crisis decision-making, and this topic came up, you definitely see, when we mentioned Oslo, for example, or the fact that it was a peace process, or even how and why Benjamin Netanyahu came to power, in the first place. That was after Rabin's assassination. Shimon Peres was supposed to be the next prime minister, right? Succeeding, and there were Hamas that started with the terrorist the suicide bombing that led to the shift to the right, and Benjamin Netanyahu became prime minister. So that history of not just the the peace process, but how this affected the politics that you see playing out right now, and the role of Hamas as a spoiler organization repeatedly over time. And so the idea of what this organization represents and what it rejects. And it rejects a two-state solution, and it rejects a Jewish state. And what we're seeing now is that for some of our students, they are just introduced to Hamas for the first time now, not completely realizing the role or the ideology of Hamas for years, and the role that he played, the spoiling role he played for many years and during critical times. So that's one thing. The other thing is seeing both Israelis as a monolith, but also the Palestinian, right? Not understanding the difference between the PA and Hamas and the dynamics of the different actors. So I'm getting a lot of questions on just unpacking this. This is this kind of dynamics within Israel, within the Palestinian society, within Arab society, but also okay, we were that close to a peace process. What happened? Why can't we just go back there? So those are the types of questions.
Amaney.
So yeah, I think understanding this history is very important, and I agree with Keren. You know, Hamas did play a spoiler role of the peace process. So in Israel, you had the assassination of Ishaq Rabin and the Baruch Goldstein attack in Hebron. Right. So it was always a tit for tat with the right wings wanting to sabotage the peace process on both sides.
On both sides. Oh,
and this
absolutely.
led to both entities moving further right, with the peace camps losing legitimacy on both ends. So this is what happened. So what happened when the peace process was ending, the truth is also it's been so difficult to teach about this topic on US campuses for a long time.
Yes.
Because there's always people looking for the buzzwords. You've had campaigns of people recording people in classes. You've had, even before social media, there was always these attempts to sort of sanction and condition what can be said. So it's much easier for the average faculty who is trying to also get tenure and publish and become well known in their field. It's much easier to say, and I see this as dean, much easier people to say, I don't want to teach the Arab Israeli.
Yeah, and this is where we have to do better.
So this sort of politicking around the subject has left a vacuum on our university campuses. And so this is where we're looking, and we were talking about this as well, where it's really important for us also, as we talk about how to have civil discourse, it's also really important if we're going to revive, if we're going to revive the intellectual if you may, of the classroom and university campuses in the US, right? Because, you know, I have opportunities to teach elsewhere where maybe I wouldn't have been able to express my opinion. And so this is something that I cherish deeply. My right as an educator to educate without worrying about getting picked up, leaving by the authorities, but leaving the classroom is something that I prize and cherish. So, but when we are conditioned and when there are efforts to censor what can and can be said, it's easier to leave that space void. And unfortunately, what we're seeing today in many ways is part of a legacy that's been put in motion.
But the legacy is also part of, like, the void that happened led to very reductionist narratives that are taught about this conflict, and overly simplified that this is all our students who wanted to take classes, this is what they were exposed to. And so we have to do better than those reductionist narratives. And the other thing that, the last thing I would say is, because we've been talking a lot of what happens in the Middle East, but how it affects the students here. And this kind of, you know, what is the difference between being critical of the Israeli government and how, you know, easy people seem to move from that to, you know, anti-Zionism, and from that to anti-Semitism and attack on Jews everywhere because of, and that to me is also a lot of work that we need to do to unpack and explain how it's wrong and how it's unacceptable to get to a point that, you know, you're, you know, from being critical of a government in Israel and seeing those really horrific anti-Semitic acts and hate speech on campus.
So Claire, can I just chime in on this? Because this is a really important point about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, because if we were in a world, and I wish we were where October 7th hadn't happened, right? If we had a counterfactual world, if you had looked at studies of Islamophobia and anti-Semitism in this country, it wasn't really about Muslims being anti-Semitic and Jews being Islamophobic. It's really about, with all due respect, the mainstream being both Islamophobic and anti-Semitic, right?
That's so
and so the idea is, in most psychological studies documenting bias and egocentrism, the likelihood is that if you're part of the mainstream and you're anti-Semitic, you are going to be also Islamophobic. And if you're part of the mainstream and you're Islamophobic, you are going to be anti-Semitic. So I always say that combating Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are the same. That is the hatred of people simply because they are Jewish or Muslim. Now we have a political conflict. And this political conflict is portrayed always as zero-sum. If you are sympathetic to Israelis, it means you're anti-Palestinian. If you are sympathizing with the people of Gaza, that means you believe that what Hamas did in Israel was sanctioned. No, I condemn what Hamas did, but I also condemn the killing of innocent lives in Gaza. I want to hold the sanctity of human life unconditionally for both groups. So this zero-sum narrative that you're either here or there is what's hurting this, and our inability to talk together about this conflict.
And false. I mean, you see this in the rhetoric. I mean, if you are for ceasefire, then you are anti-Hamas, or if you're against ceasefire, you are pro-genocide. That's what. This is how it be. You know, the discourse when we talk about toxic, zero-sum discourse, that's what we have to fight. It's just not.
There's not a lot of room for nuance, and I think you're right that the fear, not just for academicians, but for all of us who are part of this university, it's, you know, the third rail. How do we, you know, these are really, really difficult discussions. I want to ask one therefore really difficult question.
Please go ahead. So these were easy questions.
Those were all
the easy ones. Okay.
Now we're getting into the hard stuff. But you know, this is just one example. But this came up from students, and from the river to the sea phrase, which is you both wrote about in the op-ed, and there's just an enormous passion and hurt about what that phrase means, and I'm going to take the liberty of saying, and I could be wrong, that I think it really does, for so many Jewish people, feel like it's a call for genocide. And I think for a lot of Muslim or pro-Palestinian students, it's something broader. It's a call for a homeland. And I just wanted to ask directly what you think about that, and how do we, you know, how do we have conversations about something, like how do we start with something like that and maybe have that grow into something more productive?
So I had a group of students come to talk to me about that because in the op-ed I referenced the fact that the river to the sea chant is often seen by people in the Jewish community as a call for the annihilation of the state of Israel. And I base that on the use of that phrase back from the days of the PLO before they denounced terrorism and recognized the state of Israel. I mean, as Palestinians growing up in the West Bank, that was a chant. And once we entered into peace talks with the Israelis, we stopped using that chant in our protests. So this is what I was referencing. Of course, I am now in my 50s, and there's a younger generation. So the students came to me, and I met with them, and they said, you know, we're offended that you said that in your op-ed. I said, but I did want to historicize this because this is how Jewish people are hearing it. But they said, you need to hear what we think about it. I said, sure, let's have the conversation. They said, we as activists, we believe when we say from the river to the sea, it means everybody living in that territory has the right to be free. It's not about moving people into, at least during the pan-Arab nationalist days, it was about sweeping the Jews in the sea, right? That's right. So you have now two different narratives linked to the same slogan. So the argument about wanting people to be free is something that we all share, a common goal. We don't call for the annihilation of either people, right? So this is just, again, where discourse, had those students not come to me and talk to me about their deep pain and hurt, I would not have appreciated that. I still would say that given that we are trying to reconcile communities, we're trying to partner with one another, I would say to pro-Israeli protests, don't lump all the Arabs as enemies, right? I would say to pro-Palestinian protests, this has offended people. Now, I know, I'm not trying to condition what people say. I believe in free speech, but if we
can hear it outside, by the way.
And I appreciate and respect that. But let's if we're trying to reconcile, there's so many other slogans that can make these valid points about freedom, right? Free Palestine, right? So these are this type of, but I don't want to condition. I'm just trying to say, like, we're in terms of making sure that this does not become a conflict about a slogan, and does not become a conflict about what's perceived as now anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, when it's about a political conflict, that we also can sort of have arguments and discussions about what might be the most effective way. But again, I learned something. The students also thanked me because they said they learned something, and that's why this discourse is always very important.
And I totally agree with Amaney, and it's the intent versus the impact. And the impact, the intent can be benign, but the way that people, especially when you say this in front of Jewish people or Israeli people, it's deeply offensive, because you also see this slogan in the Hamas, the terrorist organization, in their manuals. And so that's what we want to make sure the students understand, because many students came to me and they said, we were chanting this, but we had no idea how it's perceived and why our fellow students were really, really upset when this was, when we were singing, when we were chanting this. And so that is an important conversation to have, but intent versus impact is another way of thinking about this.
Can I ask one final question, because it is time to wrap, but I said at the outset that it's not an easy time to be a university president. I think it's also not an easy time to be an Israeli-American academician and a Palestinian-American academician. And I wonder how the two of you have felt. You're grappling with this personally in times when you may have personally felt targeted in terms of who you are.
Oh, yeah.
Just extending the empathy. I'm modeling the empathy here.
Of course, it's been personally very difficult and a lot of anxiety, and I'm sure, we will go back to therapy after this. But it's not about me, and it's about for me at least, it's about the platform, the opportunity that I have now as a dean of an amazing policy school, diverse, largest, with students who are passionate about things that are happening in the world. And for me, every day is about, both as a scholar, but as a dean, how can I be a dean for everybody in this time? And it's very clear that people want this, they want to be engaged, they want to have those opportunities to learn. And I feel very fortunate that I have this opportunity and the platform to do more, to do better. But also, of course, because I'm Israeli, because Amaney is Palestinian, people look at us as to model how this conversation could look like, how you could have friendships and disagreement and do this in a civil way. So it's challenging for sure. The challenge is great, but the opportunity to lead, by the opportunity to model, is so much greater, and I try to focus on that.
And Claire, so everybody probably knows that I've been doxxed, right? And I think I was doxxed for obviously what I look for, like, because I had, you could look at that. Then the doxers apologized because they made a mistake. When I asked him,
I'm sure that felt great.
It felt wonderful. And I asked him, well, can he come apologize with the same truck and put it in the middle of the town for 3 days and chase me around with it? Of course, they didn't do that. But to your point, Claire, about our identities being why we're targets. When I was doxxed, there's two things that, again, we learn every day. The number of my Jewish colleagues and my Jewish friends, and I'm also involved in interfaith dialogues, who came to me and just were horrified and were apologizing up and right, as if we had, so many people came to me as Jews and said, we don't know who did this. And I kept saying, don't worry, because I said, what you guys are making me feel like? After 9/11, when every single Muslim became Al-Qaeda in America. We had to kept apologizing. You couldn't walk on the subway without saying, I denounced 9/11 and I was not a terrorist and I do not know them and I have not seen them in my mosques. I said, please don't apologize for something you guys didn't do. This is an organized outside group, right? So that's number one. Number two, though, on the other hand, the number of Palestinian and Muslim students who came to me and said, I couldn't sleep last night. I can't focus on my exam. Because if they came after an established dean at one of the best schools in one of the,
You didn't say the best,
among the best, yeah. Among the, then they will come after, what does it mean for me? I am powerless. And so these outside groups that have targeted our universities in ways that are just fomenting hate and vitriol and disempowering our students is really something that we need to have a conversation about as universities. I know we have protected speech and whatnot, but this is not healthy to what it does not make our jobs easier.
This is why we.
And I'll leave it at that. Yeah.
We have a task force on this, on the doxing. And
I want to thank you both. I mean, I think this has been an incredible conversation. You've modeled having a difficult conversation with a lot of empathy and respect, and I know we're going to want to do a lot more events like this at Columbia. And again, Amaney, thank you for making the trip.
Thank you for having me.
We have a lot of fans outside. I know they're all there cheering for you.
I look forward to having a conversation with every single student because honestly, the students are our future.
They are.
They're incredible.
We, let's say our generation failed. Well, we're still alive. But you guys, please, are going to make it better.
That's
so that's what we're counting on.
Students are a lot smarter than we are.
Well,
so
hopefully,
I think
exactly.
that's,
exactly.
Anyway,
Thank you
Thank you so much.
very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,